Alice Fraser, you were on stage last night at the Greek Centre.
Yes.
And we caught up afterwards very quickly just to touch base. You described the show as being chaotic. In fact, you were a bit apologetic about that. I didn't know what you meant because I thought the show was very smooth and very structured and very, very good. I thought it was a terrific, fluid show. What did you mean when you described your show as being chaotic?
I think the energy of the show felt a bit chaotic to me, in that it was a smaller audience than I would have liked, and so I felt like I was leaning into the wind a little bit on that. In terms of the structure of the show, you're right, it is a very structured show. I tend to write my shows sort of like a detective novel. I start from what I want people to feel at the end, and I work my way backwards from there, and a lot of the jokes are clues that make the ending feel satisfying for an audience. Sometimes I realise that I write my shows upside down.
One interesting thing about
in that I'm
Kronos
often
is
quiet in a show where a traditional comedy show wouldn't be
nature
loud.
of it compared
I
to
start
some
quite
of
chilled
stuff
out. You meant to
you've
finish
done
with your best
before.
joke and start with your
Savage,
second best
for
joke.
instance,
And I tend to
is
start in a very chill
almost
way
a
and
spoken
finish in
word
quite a
performance
chill way as
with
well.
some
I don't know what
stand-up
that
in
impulse
it.
is, but it's almost
This
like a photo negative
show
of the
seems
show,
to be the reverse.
which I learned
It's
because I
very,
was
very
downstairs from
stand-up,
Adam Richard,
if you
who's
like,
quite a structured performer,
with a
and
bit
every
of
time I
spoken word in
went
it, but
quiet,
it's
he would go
a
loud.
very
It
stand-up
was like,
show.
oh, that's really
Is it the most stand-up-ish show that you've done so far?
Oh, I don't know. See, I think Savage is quite funny throughout. And it was important for me that it should be. I think I'm probably a better stand-up now than I was when I wrote Savage. I'm also probably happier in my life now. I know you meant to be a miserable artist, but I don't know. For me, I did that trilogy, Savage, The Resistance, and Empire, which was all quite personal and about my family. And then this second trilogy is an exercise in not gutting myself on stage, because you can't constantly mine your own worst experiences for catharsis for the audience. I didn't want to be that kind of performer. The reason I wrote Savage was because it was the only show that I could write at the time I had a show on, and I had to get on stage and do something. And then I ended up really finding that show I really liked it a lot. I thought it was a good show, and I enjoyed performing it. But this show, which is this trilogy, which is Ethos, Mythos, and Kronos, is kind of an exercise in not doing that, in telling stories that are slightly less painful, maybe, or something like that. So Ethos was the double act with the robot, and then Mythos was about my grandfather, who I never met, and then this one is about what it's about.
Can you just unpack for a moment how you feel you are now as a stand-up? You say you're a better stand-up now than you were when you did Savage.
Yes.
I'm very keen to know about that, because apart from the very distinctive signature moments in Kronos, where you know that this is an Alice Fraser show because you are speaking truth and you get very emotional and you really appear to connect with the audience. It's a very, as I said before, it's a very fluid, joke-filled, beautifully delivered show. How do you rate yourself now as a stand-up?
I think I wouldn't be doing stand-up if I didn't think I was constantly improving. I'm not really interested in getting stuck doing one thing, and I think I'm a better stand-up than I was when I did Savage. I love Savage. I think it might be my best piece of work. But as far as stand-up, it's not by no means my best stand-up. It was the first jokes I ever wrote. It was my first proper big solo show that I'd ever done. So of course that's not going to be your best stand-up. This show is about attention and time and focus. And so I need to have it be funny throughout, because I'm dealing with some quite drawn-out ideas, so it needs to be engaging. I always think of, stand-up for me is a rhetorical tool to keep people's focus on complicated ideas.
You make a quip at the beginning of the show that other comedians are much more naturally funny, or you
Yes.
said they're better at it than you, that you have to work hard to be funny.
Yes.
Again, can you just explain exactly what you mean?
I mean, I think that's pretty obvious. I think if you meet me, if you talk to me, I am immediately, as is evident from this conversation, quite an intense and serious person. I value comedy because it's hard won. And when I started doing comedy, it was because I was bad at it. I was one of those people who was like always told that I was, talented and stuff like that as a kid, which I loathed. I found it really intimidating and upsetting, the idea that you are, that you're meant to do something, that you're meant to have some natural something that you're not working at, it just arrives and you've got this talent and you need to express. I just found that really stressful. So I did stand up the first time and I was dreadful, like truly dreadful. And I thought, here's something that I don't care about, that I can work at and see, because if things come easily to you, this is sounding like boasting, but it's not. If things come easily to you, you don't know how to work. And you fail to learn how to do the work. And so I wanted to do something that was hard for me, because I found myself shying away from things that I wasn't naturally good at, avoiding those things. And I don't think that's a good thing for a life. So I started comedy, I was dreadful at it, I worked at it, and now I'm good. And that's really satisfying.
You also said that you're not to everybody's taste.
No, I'm not.
What do you mean? Whose taste are you to? Who are your people?
The people who come to my show and enjoy what I do are my people, and the people who come to my show and don't enjoy it are probably not my people.
But how would you define someone who likes your brand of comedy in particular?
Literally that. Just that they like it. I don't know what they have in common with one another. And actually one of the wonderful things about my Patreon is that there are so many weird and different people from all over the world who just have nothing in common with one another. I have a sheet metal worker in Minnesota and an economics student in Germany and someone doing artificial intelligence out of Edinburgh University. All these people who come together because they like what I do and I get to talk to them. Ridiculous, like a ridiculous privilege. But I don't know what... If I knew what they had in common, I would find it easier to fill my rooms because I could market in a directed way.
How did it feel like playing to a room that was, I think it was about 30 people last night? Does it put you off? Does it make you work harder? Some comedians are energised by the fact that they have a more intimate group than a crowded house.
Look, as overall in the festival, it's fucking depressing. It's depressing. I'm selling as few tickets as I sold my first year here, and that is heartbreaking. I think the work is better than that. I think that I would like to be dealing with full rooms, of course, but I like the show, and I never blame an audience for not being bigger than they are. You can't blame the people who are in the room for not being more people. I find that sometimes if you are in a small audience and a comedian is made uncomfortable by the small audience, it makes you feel self-conscious as an audience. It's not your fault. Even a quiet audience, which is very frustrating from the perspective of a comedian, they give you no energy, so you have to pour out more and more of yourself. It's not their fault. Being an audience is a sort of an alchemical process between the people in the room and the vibe and the temperature and the day of the week and the weather, and all of that is what, they might just sit there and want to appreciate it and be quiet and be laughing on the inside. As a comedian, that's very frustrating, but again, it's not their fault. You just have to give them as good a show as you can. Sometimes if you're tired, it feels impossible to give them the energy that you would like.
Can you define the nexus between comedy and drama in your work? Because you like crossing that line sometimes at unexpected moments, and those moments seem to be when the audience becomes fully captivated in what you're saying and in what you're thinking.
Yes. The nexus between comedy and drama is not comedy and something else. Rhetoric, maybe, persuasion, humanity.
Pathos.
Pathos. I didn't call the show Pathos, although I wanted to. For me, comedy is a rhetorical tool. It's not an end in itself. And I know for many comedians it is. It's just be funny. That's the job. Be funny. And maybe because I am not naturally funny, I see it as a thing that I use to convey meaning. I never understood the idea of it's just a joke. A joke is as meaningful as anything else. It has content. It has meaning. It is persuasive in its own way. It's a rhetorical tool. So rhetoric for me is about communicating. It's about taking an idea from my head and putting it in someone else's head. And the great thing about comedy is that you can see when they get it because they laugh. So you can tell that they are following your thread of thought because they laugh at the right time. If they don't get it, they don't laugh, and you need to work harder at the joke. It's a really fantastic way to understand whether they understand what you're saying. And that for me is the most important thing. I want people to feel human, and comedy is my way of making us all feel human together, because you can't laugh with someone and hate them at the same time. So
I have a macro, micro question.
yes.
Okay. Micro. How is your world better because of your comedy?
I have proven to myself that I can do this thing, which is to say I was dreadful at it, I am now good at it, I'm competent at my job, I make a living at my job, I know how hard I worked to get here, and I can feel really proud of what I did. Nobody gave it to me, nobody helped me, there was no nepotism involved, I have no family connections, no one lent me money, I just did it by working, and so I feel really satisfied by my professional life. I also used to be a lawyer, and you bill yourself out in 6-minute increments. And I know exactly how much my time is worth, and I know what I have bought with that time. That I think I spend a lot of that money that I'm not making on freedom, and I feel so much happier with the freedom that I have as a comedian than the money I would have as a lawyer.
How is the world better because of your comedy?
I think for the people who like my comedy, it does what I want it to do. For the people who connect with it, it does the thing that I desire, which is to make them feel more human and make them feel more conscious of the humanity of the people around them. I think we live in a world that can be very disassociative. It can dissociate you from yourself. You can go through the world in a dream of content and Netflix and notifications and never really be in yourself. And the people around you can feel like non-player characters in a video game. And to a certain extent, that's has to be the case in a city. You cannot fully engage with the humanity of everyone you pass in the street. It would be devastating. But in the room, the people around you, the performer on the stage, we can have that space. I buy people that space to feel really human. That might sound arrogant, but again, it's only the people who connect with what I do. And I'm sure there are plenty of people who sit in my shows completely unmoved and are like, ugh, I don't know why you recommended that. And then they don't come back the next year, and that's fine, But yes, that's what I think I do.
Can you tell us how important your mother is to your work as a comedian?
How important is, well, I would say my comedy is about my life, and my mother is as important to my comedy as she is to my life, which is to say very important. I think anyone would say the same thing, but because I had the privilege of growing up looking after her and knowing that she was going to die, I think I spent more time being grateful for my mother, particularly in those teenage years where a lot of people feel that they have to create distance to become their own person. I never felt like I had that particular privilege of being able to go fuck you and run away for a few years. I really got to have a proper, close relationship with her all of my life, and I feel very grateful for that.
Is there anything in particular that you're trying to work out while you perform? are you, when you're up there, are you trying to work through an understanding of the world,
God,
of
no.
yourself? No?
By the time I'm on stage, I've already worked through it. Comedy is never therapy for me. It might be therapy for the audience, but everything I do on stage is very deliberate. Even and especially the moments where I look uncertain. Often those are me being like a spirit guide for the audience. I take, if I'm trying to get them to swallow something big, I take their hand and I bring them through this valley of uncertainty, which I do by performing uncertainty, the uncertainty that I may have felt when I first had the idea or whatever it is, because you can't just present people with conclusions, then it's a lecture. It's a journey and I take people through it, and this sounds really wanky, but if I look uncertain, there are two reasons. Either I'm giving you the time and space to come with me through the idea that took me however long to come up with, I can't just bring you to the end of it, or it's Australia and they don't like it when you come off as cocksure, particularly if you're a woman. So you have to perform uncertainty, insecurity and low status on stage in order to get an audience not to go, well, who the fuck does she think she is?
Can I just quickly ask you about the level of articulation that you sometimes have in your show? You obviously love words and you love being very precise with your words. For instance, can you remind us your definition of motherhood, being a mother?
In this particular form of motherhood, you make somebody inside yourself, out of yourself, who's going to be sad when you die.
Do you ever get anyone, whether it's from an audience or another performer, saying, Alice, you're getting too wordy? Or do you adjust the level of articulation from audience to audience? Or do you just say, no, this is the way I'm saying it, and you just put it out there?
It depends. If it's a solo show, you're here to see me and what I do. So I will deliver the same words, but I might deliver them depending on the vibe of the audience with more or less confidence. Sometimes an audience needs to know that you don't think you're that great, so you'll say something and then look a little bit, If it's a club gig, I'm there for them. They're there to see comedy, they're not there to see me, and so I will adjust what I do to suit the audience. So I have a particular set for a late night show, or I'll adjust my set for that gig. But equally, I really strongly believe that you can get anyone up to a really highfalutin fancy idea if you give them the on-ramp. One of my favourite jokes that I ever wrote was about how we're very bad at dealing with things we can't quantify, and it's a dick joke. And so that's one of the most complicated ideas in the world, that you can, people say they value happiness, but they will always count money and sacrifice their happiness for the money, even if they know it's more important, because you can't count happiness. That's a very difficult thing to say in a funny way, but it works as a dick joke. And I really love that, because someone will laugh at that at midnight drunk in a pub in the middle of nowhere, but it's actually a very, I think, quite a complicated idea to get your head around.
You mentioned before that you were a corporate lawyer.
Yes.
And corporate lawyers make lots of money.
Yes. I was a junior for a year, so I wasn't at that point where you start to make money yet.
Yeah, but as a junior lawyer, you know that your future
Yes.
can be extremely lucrative.
Yes.
You, in your show, talk about Patreon and talk about being underpaid, and you mentioned before that, you're playing to small rooms this festival, and that you're under financial stress, I would imagine. Do you ever reflect back and think, you know what, maybe I could have done the lawyering and the comedy?
No, even if I didn't do the comedy, I couldn't have continued with the lawyering. It was not my ecosystem. I couldn't breathe the air. I would not have survived in any recognizable form. So I would have had to change myself kind of really fundamentally. There are people who really thrive in that environment, and I'm not saying that they are immoral or amoral. There are people who are just suited to it better than I was. I was not suited to it, and I would have had to distort my personality, or I would have killed myself. Genuinely, it was not the place for me. So for me, it was between comedy and academia when I left the law. It was never between comedy and the law.
Can you just tell us quickly about this project that was on Audible this show that you did. Can you just tell us what was it? How big was it? And how little did you get paid?
So this is as with many comedy anecdotes, this is a couple of different things that are folded into one. But I did a series of documentaries with Dr. Ashram Pura. They are on Audible. There's one on habit change, one on meditation, one on work-life balance, and one on wellness that I did on my own. One of them was in the top 5 most downloaded titles on Audible. That was the habit change one across the UK and Australia and the US. And then one of them, I think possibly also the habit change one, was number 7 in India for an extended period of time, which is to say it got a lot of downloads and I got paid not very much for it with no back end. I got paid a flat fee of about £1,000, which is fine. At the time I was grateful for it. That's what streaming services do. You either get a flat fee up front or you get a very, very small fraction of the download numbers. I think that's dreadful. I think it's not good. So yeah, I just put that in my show, and it feels weird to put it into your show because you're not meant to boast as a comedian. You're meant to play low status, but I feel like...
Well, what you're doing is you are stressing, as many other comedians stress, that there's no security in this gig.
No.
That, there's no pension plan, there's no superannuation, there's no benefits. As you say, you are an independent artist, you don't get maternity leave.
No.
So that's the point that you're stressing, that it's a tough life. And after these 2 years of coronavirus, it's almost accentuated how hard it can be.
Well, yes, I feel, look, if people don't want to pay for content, that's one thing. But the reality is that if you do not pay for content, the only people who will be artists are wealthy amateurs and people who are paid by corporate interests. If that's what you want, don't pay for content. Fine. Then you just have rich people doing their hobby and people who are being paid, sponsored by Coca-Cola. And that's the arts environment that we will be faced with. Or people who are willing to starve for their arts, which I think is what a lot of people secretly think should be how it's done. Because we have this idea of the arts as sort of naturally God-given. People have a talent for the arts. It's sort of inspiration strikes them. It's not a craft. It's not a labor. It's not real work. It gives you joy to do your art. And therefore, you shouldn't be paid because it makes you happy. Real work, is miserable and effortful, and you are compensated for your suffering, not for the value that you add. And I hate that. I really hate that as a way of thinking about labour, a way of thinking about work. We're very bad at quantifying things.
Could I get your views on cancel culture? Is cancel culture a cancer?
No. Cancel culture is a technological phenomenon, which is to say that normal criticism now comes at you in a barrage from thousands of people who don't understand the context. It becomes a point-scoring exercise, right? So you do something wrong publicly, and then it may or may not go viral. If it goes viral, people who've never heard of you will feel it's important to their identity to put in their 2 cents on this, as against other people around them. They don't think of you as a person, you're just a target. But from your perspective, it comes at you in a cascade. For powerful people, you can argue that that's not a big deal, but I think we as people are geared to really want one another's approval. So that pain is real, the suffering is real. There are very few examples where someone is really cancelled, I think, as in that they never come back onto the scene, that they lose their job, that they lose their livelihood. That I think is rare, but one of the examples of it happening that I often use, because it's an example of it happening in the opposite direction, is Yasmin Abdel-Magid, who had to leave Australia because of a tweet. Essentially, a tweet. She had to leave Australia, and she's started her career again in London, and sure, fine, she still has a career, but that is cancel culture, right? I don't think it's very good. I think we need better ways to have productive discussions. What's the point of having a back and forth if we don't make progress, if you're just shutting people up? I don't think that's great. So I don't think it's a cancer. I do think it's a problem. I think it's a problem we can solve if we try.
It's almost like an era of over-punishment, that it's not just enough to acknowledge or to identify someone as having made a mistake, but it's like, well, you made a mistake and you must die now.
Yeah.
You must be split in half.
Yeah. People don't see it as... Individually, if someone were talking to you, no one would ever say that to somebody else's face unless they were mad. It's the level of separation that you get is like road rage, but the internet makes you very easily to depersonalize someone else. Or we're very bad at assessing the impact of our words, because when you write something online, it feels like you're dropping your words into an empty pond, just like that. You don't think about the way that they arrive with impact in somebody else's pocket, in their hand, in their life, into their face. It feels like you have to speak very loudly on the internet to even be heard, because there's so much chaos and there's so much stuff. So you scream your opinion with the most violent and intense rhetoric because you want to get it out there, and you don't understand it. It's arriving like right at that volume in somebody's face. So there's a distortion of perception that we need to solve somehow with the algorithms or whatever it is that we're going to do.
You are a prolific podcaster and you do it extremely well.
Thank you.
What part of you is filled by doing podcasting that's not filled anywhere else? What does podcasting do for you?
I mean, people will pay me to do it. I don't know. I like podcasting because you're talking directly to people, and people listen from the beginning to the end, and they listen when they're in the mood for you. So you make a connection like no other thing. Television, they might flick you on halfway through. The radio, they might flick you off halfway through. Podcasting, people listen when they're in the mood for you. So you are always desired. You're always what they want at that time. And they don't take you out of context. They take you in full. So it's a very good forum for interesting and complicated things.
Alice Fraser, as a prolific podcaster, do you believe that there are too many podcasts?
No, I don't think there's too many podcasts. I don't think it's my place to assess how many podcasts there are. There's only a certain amount of podcasts that any one person can listen to. And it's probably a crowded market now, which means it's harder to make money. But I don't think that's a bad thing in itself.
You often describe yourself as a satirist.
Yes. No. I am described by others sometimes as a satirist.
What's your take? Do you see yourself as a satirist?
No.
No.
I think I do comedy I think I do satire sometimes. I don't think of myself as a comedian. I think I do comedy. I find it awkward to label myself. I think you are what you do at the time that you're doing it, but I'm not asleep a comedian. I'm not a satirist when I'm on the toilet. I mean, occasionally I have a good idea. But yes, I don't really think of myself as a satirist.
Okay. Having said that,
Yes.
you have a very sharp observational mind, especially when it comes to culture
Yes.
and pop culture,
Yes.
vis-a-vis your brilliant review of Fast and Furious 8, The Fate and the Furious.
Yes.
So that has got to be one of the most articulate and brilliantly funny
Thank you.
reviews of a film I've heard delivered live in a long time. So congratulations on that. But Alice Fraser, do you have a view about the state of satire on television?
I don't watch television, and I don't think many people of my age watch television, and so I think a lot of the satire on television is for a very comfortable audience that wants to hear its own opinions reflected back at itself through a mirror that has a filter on it. So you can look at the television and go, I am clever, aren't I?
You pretty much nailed it. Yeah. Okay, I'm just going to leave it at that. But it's a pretty palace state. Alice Fraser, your father was Jewish.
Yes.
Your mother was Catholic.
Yes.
You were brought up Buddhist.
Yes.
How does a banjo fit into that?
My mum was a folk musician, so she would play the banjo, but she also played the cello. She was one of those genius people who could pick up any instrument and play it, but she would play the banjo in a folk band. So I grew up with that sound in my ears, and when I started doing comedy, things were a little bit less friendly towards women than they are even now. And I found that if I went on stage, particularly as a young woman, the reaction of the audience more often than not, was, oh yeah. And if I came on with a banjo, it'd be like, they'd lean forward. It broke that circuit that meant that people hadn't already put you in a box, so you could get out a few jokes and prove yourself before they decided that you couldn't be funny because you were a woman. You were sort of a just odd shape. And so that was why I started playing the banjo on stage, and I still do it kind of as a crutch and kind of because I'm fond of it, and kind of because I have my mother's banjo on stage with me, and that's a nice thing.
You just mentioned there about sexism in comedy.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Can you just give me your reading on sexism in comedy in 2022?
I mean, how long have you got? There is sexism in society, and so there will be sexism in comedy. Comedy is very well suited to people who, so as we were mentioning before, you don't get maternity leave, you have no security, you're often out late at night. It's very hard to be a woman in an industry that is essentially insecure, whether that's because women are like biologically suited to comfort or whatever, or whether you just cannot look at a comedy career and think, well, I can be comfortable and safe, I can have a child, I can look after the people around me, I can look after myself, I can guarantee my own safety for the next 15 years. The idea of being a road dog as an old woman is not a very appealing idea. Comedy is inherently, as an industry, in Australia particularly, not a good bet. It's not a good gamble, and that's putting completely aside the hostility of some audiences and the hostility of some of your colleagues. So that, I think, is what gets discussed a lot as an essentially, as in and of itself. If no one were hostile to you, it would still be a difficult thing to do. And then the moment you add in the ways in which people try to welcome you into a room by being rude to you in the way they would if you were a guy. So that's the best case scenario, is you walk in and they're like, the hooker's here. That's their way of saying welcome. You know, you can play with the big boys, we're mean to each other. And then you have to figure out how to negotiate that. Do you go in over the top, go, you couldn't afford me, mate, I know how much you're being paid for this gig. Do you say, thank you for the welcome, I'm going to be like you? Or do you say, no, I'm not comfortable with that, don't treat me like that, treat me with respect. And then you're shutting down the vibe, and then you're not cool, and then you're not their friend, and then they don't book you because people only book their friends.
Given that we now have over a century of film and stage work that prove that women are as funny as men. It's all on the record. I mean, the 70s were full of brilliant women. To hear female comedians talk about the fact that the comedy scene, the live comedy scene, has sexism in it is counterintuitive to anyone who appreciates women comedians. Carol Burnett, Joan Rivers, there's a zillion of them. Can you make sense of this? Bev Killick couldn't. What's going on?
People have ideas about the world, and some people need a lot of outliers before they'll shift the line on their graph.
I love that song that you do, the sexy sex song, where you're talking about...
Don't objectify me, except sometimes when I would like you to, yes.
Can you define the comedy space that you're identifying there? What are you addressing? What triggered that incredibly funny song about deliberately conflicted emotions and impulses?
That's where it's interesting for me. Everything, there are so many blanket statements being made. It is wrong to objectify women, and that's a really nice thing to get on board with. And then you think, but sometimes I would like someone to, treat me like a beautiful object, but not when I don't want them to. And they shouldn't think that they are entitled to, but also maybe someone you could just try it. Like that, I think, is where it's interesting. I'm not really interested in spouting a party line. I'm not interested in reflecting someone's ideas back at them in a beautiful filter. I want people to be engaged and interested and challenged.
That song seems to acknowledge the truth that human beings are built up of contradictions. We all have contradictions.
Yes.
That seems to
I mean,
flag.
just as a general rule, I don't want perfect art by perfect people. I want complex, conflicted, contradictory art by complex, conflicted, contradictory people. Because otherwise, I don't see myself in a perfect person. I don't see myself in a perfect piece of art. I see myself in flawed characters and in people who are trying their best without getting it right all the time. And I feel like that's sort of missing from a lot of discussions nowadays.